למען ציון לא אחשה, ולמען ירושלים לא אשקוט.
You are listening to Hebrew Voices with Nehemiah Gordon. Thank you for supporting Nehemiah's McCore Hebrew Foundation. Learn more at nehemiahswall.com.
Shalom, this is Nehemiah Gordon with Hebrew Voices, and I am coming to you today with a very special guest, Dr. Richard Carrier. I'm in Israel, he's in California, and today we're going to talk about the pagan background of Christmas and parallels that exist in the pagan world. And let me just tell you a little bit about Dr. Carrier. He's really an amazing guy. Richard Carrier is a PhD in the history of philosophy from Columbia University and is a published philosopher and historian specializing in contemporary philosophy of naturalism and in Greco-Roman philosophy, science, and religion and the origins of Christianity. He blogs regularly, lectures for community groups worldwide, and teaches courses online. He is the author of many books, including Senses and Goodness Without God. Guys, I'll be honest, I'm probably not going to read that book. Another book called On the Historicity of Jesus, which I've read part of. It's an amazing book, even though I don't agree with a lot of it. And another book called Proving History, as well as chapters in several anthologies and articles in academic journals. For more about Dr. Carrier and his work, he's got a website, www.richardcarrier.info. I'm going to post the link to that website on my website, nehemiahswall.com. Hello, Dr. Carrier. How are you doing over there in California?
Hello, doing well.
I feel like I've got to give the audience a little bit of a disclaimer, which is Dr. Carrier is an atheist. And you guys know I'm a Karaite Jew. I believe in the Hebrew Bible. And I've interviewed other academic scholars, and I honestly don't know if those scholars were atheists or not. So why is it that I even mentioned this about Dr. Carrier? I look at him as an advocate for atheism or humanism and naturalism.
Yeah.
Is that a fair description?
Yeah, being accurate. Yeah. I'm a well-known atheist activist, so it is well-fitting to mention that fact.
And if people want to turn off the program, I think it's a big mistake, but you've been warned. You know, we're going to talk about Christianity, but Dr. Carrier could do a whole program talking about Judaism, and he doesn't believe Moses existed. I believe he existed. Dr. Carrier doesn't believe Jesus existed. I'm not a Christian, but I do believe he existed, that there was an historical man named Yeshua. What I really want to focus on today is this topic of Christmas, which... And look, I've never celebrated Christmas in my life. And it's my understanding, Dr. Carrier, you as an atheist actually do celebrate Christmas. Is that right?
Yeah, I do. I mean, in reality, pretty much everything that we think is distinctive of Christmas is actually pagan. So,
guys, you heard it there from the atheists.
And we don't believe in the pagan gods, but we still celebrate the fun festival. Christmas has become a secular tradition in many ways.
Here's why I invited Dr. Carrier in the program. Whatever you guys think about his personal faith, or I guess lack thereof, he really is an impressive scholar. And look, I come from the world of academia, and I have had conversations with PhDs and tenured professors who just take at face value what other scholars say. And they build these piles on piles of, we're saying this because other scholars have said it. And when you try to dig down, well, what are the actual sources? You're quoting some scholar who's quoting another scholar who's quoting another scholar. What do the sources say? And that's what I was really impressed with. I was reading, or I heard maybe, I don't remember, it was a podcast or something, and you were describing, Dr. Carrier, these claims by, and I don't even know who was making the claim.
Oh, you're talking about Freke and Gandhi.
Yeah, so Freke and Gandhi were saying that the Christian sacrament, which is, for my Jewish listeners, that's eating the wafer and drinking the wine, which is the body and blood of Jesus, that actually comes from the religion of Mithraism, which was an ancient paganism that was competing with Christianity. And I think maybe many atheists would have just jumped on that bandwagon and used it to slam Christianity. And you did something really radical. You said, let's go check if this is true.
Yeah.
And what did you find?
It's very important to me to make sure that we can actually ground any claim we make in actual evidence. So I've been very critical of other Jesus mythicists who don't do that. So there is a lot of really bad stuff.
And what is a Jesus mythicist for those who don't know?
People who think Jesus didn't exist as a person, that the gospel Jesus is a myth, or actually just Jesus in general is a myth that was invented for the gospels.
Okay. So in other words, I believe there was an historical man, a Jewish man 2,000 years ago named Yeshua HaNotzli, Jesus of Nazareth, and you don't.
Right.
But you were an atheist before that.
Correct.
You came to that conclusion. Okay, which is what I really respect. In other words, this doesn't advance your atheist agenda because whether Jesus existed or not, you're still an atheist, right?
Yeah, and in fact, for years as an atheist historian, I actually attacked the mythicists. I was defending the historicity of Jesus, so I was on the other side of that camp.
Okay.
For me, it doesn't really matter one way or the other as far as, I mean, my reasons for rejecting Christianity have nothing to do with whether Jesus existed or not. But that's a whole separate question.
So Freke and Gandhi, and you were critical of mythicists.
Yeah, their book, The Jesus Mysteries. Everybody was praising this book. Not everybody, but a lot of people are saying, oh, wow, this book has some amazing claims. And go, okay, well, I'll look into that. And first of all, I sort of skimmed through it and I says, I don't know, a lot of this looks dodgy. But I said, well, okay, so I'll try vetting it. So I don't know if it's the first page, but very nearly the first page in the book They come right out saying something like this. I'm not doing an exact quote.
Yeah, paraphrasing.
So there's this document in Mithraism, and he quote it, supposedly, and it has Mithra basically doing the exact same Eucharist thing that we have in 1 Corinthians 11, where it says, this bread is my body, this wine is my blood. And I was looking at that, I was like, holy cow. I'm like, all the research I've done, I've never run into this. This is an amazing find.
It's like a new text you've never heard of.
Yeah. How can this be true? Where did they find this? First thing I do is I go to their footnotes, which they're not very good at assembling footnotes. So it's just that, where did they find this? And so they quote some historian, I don't remember if it was early 20th century or 19th century, some old historian. Oh, this isn't looking good. Okay, so rather than the primary source.
Let's explain that for the audience. What would you like them to quote?
The actual source document that they're quoting.
In other words, something written from a Mithraist manuscript or from an ancient Christian who quoted a Mithraist or something. Is that what you're looking for?
Exactly. Yeah. It should be something in the first 300 years of the Common Era, right?
Instead of they're quoting some guy from 100 years ago. How does he know?
Yeah, no, right. But I knew going in, and I've written an article about Kersey Graves, those who want to look into that. He did the 16 crucified saviors.
Tell the story.
Right. Most of that is bogus. But that's a typical example of 19th century scholarship. There's a lot of crap scholarship from then. So whenever I see somebody citing someone from then, a scholar from then, I'm very suspicious right away. So I said, well, all right, I'll go down this rabbit hole. Let's find out. So I dug up, found that really super obscure book. And I think it even quoted another one. And so I went and found that one. And then finally, the one I get all the way back to a scholar who actually discusses the source. Mm-hmm. And it explodes the whole thing. And when I look at that actual analysis, what it turned out to be was this was a quotation from a late medieval document by a Christian writing ignorantly about Zoroastrianism. And in fact, he was claiming that Zoroaster, not Mithra, had said this. But we have no evidence that that was ever the case, that the Zoroastrian scriptures that survive don't have this. There's no ancient evidence of this being the case. We have something similar happening when Christians, the Spaniards who went into Mesoamerica, when they report the Mesoamerican native beliefs, they report them as if they're just like Christian beliefs. So a lot of it is being distorted through this filter. They just take whatever the natives say and then sort of throw on layers of Christianity.
Why do you think they're doing that? Are they just interpreting it through their own filter, or?
I don't know, and that's something I haven't investigated. All I know is that is a problem.
That's really interesting. So basically, the guy makes the claim that the Mithraists have the same exact Eucharist.
Creek and Gandy are implying that it's pre-Christian.
And it's some source talking about Zoroastrianism. And we actually have a lot of writings of Zoroastrianism. I don't think we have very much about Mithraism from what I've read.
No.
Like we have all these, like you call them comic books, I think, in your writings. Meaning we have these graphics in their temples, but what the story is behind those graphics isn't entirely clear. It's like Mithra killing a bull.
We have some hints in a variety of texts, like people will reference it, but we have no actual writings of Mithraists. We don't have the Gospels of Mithra.
So these guys quote something as being a Mithraic source, and it's just not true.
It's not verifiable. I find
it's not verifiable. That's an important
distinction. It's almost certainly not true.
We can't prove that it's true. That's for sure.
Yeah, but I think if it were true, there would be ancient sources discussing this, because I think it's highly unlikely that no one noticed this. And there are Christians who talk about the similarities between Mithraism and their religion, and they don't mention this. And I'm sure they would have done if that was an issue.
Okay.
They had their own theories as to how certain things preceded their religion. That is, the devil was emulating.
And we're going to talk about that. I want to spend a whole section talking about that. You know, the reason I brought this topic up is a lot of my listeners are people who did celebrate Christmas at one time, and then they found out that there are pagan origins of Christmas, which I think most Christian scholars don't deny. Like there was that movie with Kirk Cameron where he did deny it, but most Christian scholars, I think, don't deny it, like serious scholars. But what they then do is they start piling on paganism and start identifying all the paganism throughout all history. And this actually goes back to Alexander Hislop, who was this guy in the 19th century who wrote a book called The Two Babylons. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
No, but this is a familiar story, but go on.
Okay, basically, it's a guy in the 19th century who said that the Roman Catholic Church is sun worship, and it goes back to the sun worship of the Tower of Babel, that Semiramis was married to Nimrod. And when I first encountered this, I'm like, wow, this is pretty cool stuff. And I did the exact same thing you did. I read Greek, but I don't read ancient Latin. But I was looking at these sources trying to find it, and I keep going back to this guy in the 1800s who's writing this, and I'm like, well, where are the Assyrian sources about Semiramis? Okay, so she was a queen regent of Assyrian Empire. Like, where does this go back to Nimrod? Nimrod is a character from the Bible who was some kind of hunter. He had nothing to do with the Tower of Babel, according to the Bible. That's later rabbinical legends, and it has nothing to do with Semiramis. And I'm like, well, where does this stuff come from? And that's why I wanted to talk to you. I wanted to get down to the nitty-gritty of if Christmas is pagan, and we're not talking about the Christmas tree. I'm talking about like basically the early background of Christmas, if we can talk about that. So what are those parallels? Meaning, are those parallels everything that's been made out that Samaramis's husband Nimrod was killed and then reborn as the baby Tammuz, according to Alexander Hislop? I've studied the Tammuz myths as far as I can access the sources and haven't seen anything like that. But
No. I've never even heard that theory. That's ridiculous. I mean, there are possible connections to the Inanna Tammuz myth when you get to the level of the crucifixion and the crucifixion theology.
so talk to us about Inanna and Tammuz. Let's start with that.
I haven't studied the birth narratives of Inanna and Tammuz. I have studied the death narratives. We have one for Inanna. The Tammuz part is broken off, but we have an ancient tablet, a Sumerian tablet, that has the story of Inanna. What we have in the fragment that we have is that Inanna, for some reason, and the part that has the reason is missing, but for some reason she decides to descend from heaven past earth into the underworld. And she goes through 7 gates, and at each gate, part of her clothing is mandated to be taken off. By the time she gets to the core of the underworld, she's completely naked, and then she's captured and she's tried in a kangaroo court, and she's killed by a death spell by the Lord of the Underworld, and her naked body is nailed up. So she's basically crucified. And then 3 days later, her minions come down, feed her the food and water of life, and she resurrects and ascends to glory in heaven.
So this is an ancient Sumerian goddess that we have from, give us a millennium. What are we talking about? The second millennium BC or?
The tablets are about 1700 BC.
1700 BC. Okay.
Yeah. And we have hints that there was a similar story told of Tammuz, and that this was kind of like an annual cycle between Inanna and Tammuz. But we don't have the actual narrative for Tammuz. We only have the narrative for Inanna.
And you mean from the Sumerian sources, from the actual original pagan sources?
Yes.
Who believed in Inanna? We don't have the story about Tammuz dying and resurrecting.
Yeah.
Okay. That's important.
We have references to that being the case, but we just don't have the actual story. And this is an actual manuscript. The manuscript itself is pre-Christian, not just the story.
It's actually a clay tablet, isn't it? It's like a cuneiform clay tablet.
That's right. And Samuel Noah Kramer has it reproduced in his book, History Begins at Sumer, for those who want to look this up.
So this is what I love. You can actually go and look at this source and you can say, you know what, this has nothing to do with anything whatsoever. It is important or it's not important, but you can't deny that this source exists.
Yeah.
The source is there. And if there are parallels, you got to ask yourself the question, so why is it that there was this ancient pagan deity before the time of Jesus who was crucified and resurrected? And the ancient Christians actually dealt with this. It's really interesting. I've seen a lot of Christians who, when somebody brings this up, they'll want to avoid it. You know, I was reading yesterday in preparation for this in the writings of Justin Martyr in the Dialogues of Trypho, and the Jew Trypho brings this up, not Inanna, but other parallels. He says, how can you believe these things like the pagans believe? And Justin's response is, these actually strengthen my faith. These don't shake my faith, they strengthen my faith. And I say, look, if you're a Christian who believes in Jesus, you should know at least what Justin was talking about. At least know what your own sources say. So what are some of the responses that you found in the Christian literature to this type of thing? You started talking about that before. And I guess one of them is Justin.
First of all, they acknowledge and don't deny that there are these dying and rising gods before Christianity. And Justin's argument is that the devil kind of was trying to guess at what God was going to do to create Christianity. So he made all these fake Christianities to try and discredit it in advance. That's called diabolic mimicry argument.
So Satan imitates the ways of the church is the way I've heard it described.
Right, but in advance, before the church even exists, to try and create this discrediting thing. It's kind of similar to how the young earth creationists claim that the devil planted all the fossils in the ground to trick people into believing in evolution.
Okay, I'm a young earth creationist and don't believe that particular version of it. But anyway, let's move on. That's okay.
But it's a similar kind of reasoning.
Right. In other words, that Satan planted dinosaur bones to make us shake, which I don't believe personally, but
right. But there are Christians who use that argument. So Justin's kind of doing the same thing. But the reality is that isn't what convinces Justin. For Justin, I think that's just his rationalization to sort of explain away that evidence. For him, the reason he believes the Christian version versus the other ones is that he has these other more standard arguments that, well, the scriptures were so powerful, they were so affecting, I feel the presence of Jesus. His reasons are much more like the standard direct phenomenological reasons that most Christians, even today, would say is the reason that they believe in it.
Translate for my listeners into plain English, the standard phenomenological. What does that mean in plain English?
Feeling the Holy Spirit. So the common argument, you see this in a lot of Christian apologetic literature as well, Christian authors defending Christianity today, is the idea that if you invite Christ into your heart, you feel Christ in there, and therefore he must exist. So therefore that must be the one true religion. Now, this is problematic in the sense that there are other religions that have the exact same experience. But nonetheless, this is one of the reasons that Justin gives. And also the fact that he found the scriptures so not miraculously brilliant or affecting. They emotionally affected him. So he thought that the scriptures were better than the pagan scriptures because there were aspects of it. And one part of that was that he found the scriptures more fitting his particular moral sensibilities. He thought that some of the pagan literature was immoral from his perspective, and the Bible was moral from his perspective, and therefore that must come from God. Obviously, there are problems with that kind of reasoning as well, but nonetheless, these were the kinds of things that were really convincing Justin to prefer Christianity to the pagan myths, but he doesn't deny that the pagan myths did precede Christianity.
Right. So I got to go back to the phenomenological issue that you brought up, because look, I'll tell people I believe in the God of Israel because I've had personal experiences. And what you're saying is, well, Nehemiah, that's not valid because people who believe in Krishna or some other deity that I don't acknowledge, they've also had similar experiences. Is that basically what you're saying?
Yeah. Well, I myself had similar experiences convincing me that the Tao existed and governed the universe. And I was a Taoist. It was the only religion that I was a true believer in, that I actually had faith in. I was a Taoist for many years. I tell that story in my book, Sense and Goodness Without God. That comes up early in the book.
Now I've got to read it. I don't make fun of that. If somebody says, I believe in Jesus because I had a Jesus experience, my response to that is, okay, well, I haven't had that Jesus experience, but
right.
I mean, I can respect that that's been your experience. And I guess maybe some of my response is, if Jesus wants to give me that experience, he can.
Yeah.
But I haven't had that experience. And as a Jew, that's not really where I'm coming from.
I was going to recommend, there's a website called Simple to Remember. It's actually part of Judaism Online, simpletoremember.com. And they actually have a page on the history of Christmas. So people who want to see where all the specific things, like the December 25th, where does mistletoe come from, gift giving, and all of these things, where they come from, written from the perspective of a Jewish scholar.
So let's talk about December 25th. One of the things you say in your book is that, and you talk about this guy who wrote the book, what is it, the 16?
Oh, Kersey Graves, yeah.
Yeah. Tell us about that book and what you discovered about it. You have a whole article about that I'll post a link to on my website, nehemiaswall.com. Tell us a little bit about that.
This is another example of this 19th century scholarship. This is why you just can't be citing people in the 19th century. This is so commonly the case. Kersey Graves wrote this book called The 16 Crucified Saviors, in which he claims that the entire Jesus story existed 16 different times, including even in Mesoamerica. Even Krishna, I think Buddha is in there. He has a whole bunch of these gods that he claims the exact same story told over and over again. But it's just horrible scholarship because he doesn't go back to primary sources. Some of his claims are just untraceable. He doesn't even cite anything, and I have no idea where he's getting his information. Other ones, when you go and look, it doesn't back up what he's claiming.
He might be just making it up.
Well, what I suspect is someone made it up, and he's citing them. Like, he's culling the scholarship of his era.
He's saying, well, this is what the scholars say, so it must be true, without going to the original sources. Okay. This is the scholarly consensus. And now, 200 years later, 150 years later, the consensus has changed.
It's more like a telephone game. It's similar to the thing we were talking about with Mithra, where someone wrote a book about this medieval Christian manuscript about Zoroastrianism. Someone wrote about that and made the inference that Zoroaster must be Mithras and this must be a Mithraism. And then someone after that said, oh, okay, so then there's this Mithraic text that says, someone is making a mistake at each step. And then when you accumulate the mistake, the story becomes completely transformed.
You gave the example of Krishna, who is a god from Hinduism, that the sources we have about Krishna being crucified and rising from the dead are actually from the Christian era, and I think you suggest could have been influenced by Christianity. Is that right?
Yeah, this is a big problem. I mean, a better example would be the Mesoamericans, where...
For us who don't know the terminology, that's like the Native Americans of Central America?
Central America, yeah.
Like the Maya or whoever.
Right, Aztecs, Incas, Mayas. Yeah, so the Spaniards reported these sort of like their crucified God narrative, but it's almost certainly the case that wasn't what their religion actually taught. But yeah, it's being filtered through medieval Christian sources, or not medieval in this case, age of exploration Christians. It's being filtered through Christian sources in that case. In the Krishna case, there could be texts from the late medieval period in India, for example, or from India, that have incorporated the Christian teaching onto Krishna. We're not really sure. But we have to be careful of the importation of ideas from Christianity into pagan beliefs. So that's why it's very important to look for sources or texts that we can trace to be pre-Christian. That those are the only ones that can actually claim to be uninfluenced. There are some exceptions, like Plutarch, for instance, writes technically after Christianity. He writes at the end of the 1st century. But it's extremely unlikely that he would have been influenced by Christianity so early, so quickly. And there are a variety of reasons why that would be. So what he says probably does predate Christianity, even though he himself as a source does not.
Can I read what Plutarch wrote? This is in his book on the historicity of Jesus.
Go for it.
And the basic thesis is that Jesus wasn't a real historical person, that there was a belief in Jewish angelology and this angel named Yeshua, and that he was then transformed into a flesh and blood person in a later period. And then you bring this example from Plutarch, which is absolutely fascinating. And Plutarch is a Roman historian, and he's writing to this woman who worships Isis. I think she's a woman, Clea.
Yeah, she's a priestess of Isis, so she's actually a ranking member of the cult.
Right. So he writes to Clea, he says, whenever you hear the mythical stories told by the Egyptians about their gods, of their wanderings, dismemberments, and many experiences like these, you must remember what I said earlier and not think that any of these is being said to have actually happened like that or to have actually come to pass. In other words, the Egyptians, according to Plutarch, were telling these stories about Isis and Osiris, but the Egyptian intellectuals or priests knew that these stories didn't actually take place, but they had deeper symbolical meaning. Is that what Plutarch is saying?
Yeah, it's a little bit in the between, because Plutarch himself says that the death and resurrection of Osiris does take place, but it takes place in outer space.
When you say outer space in Judeo-Christian terms, that means in heaven, right? Meaning...
Well, it's more complicated than that, because heaven has many levels in ancient cosmology.
Okay, so the lower heavens.
Yeah, the lower heavens.
And Dr. Carey, I think when you call it outer space, you're poking a little fun.
No.
I'm going to call it the lower heavens. So it takes place in the lower heavens.
Yeah. Okay, sure.
Okay.
I find that problematic because there are so many prejudices and assumptions about what heaven means today.
But there's prejudice and assumptions about outer space, like we're thinking of little green men.
Well, but see, that's the thing. That's actually closer to what they're talking about.
All right. So what you call outer space, what I call the lower heavens. So what happened in the outer space or lower heavens?
Well, every year, according to the true doctrine that the priests teach to the upper ranking members.
And this is the priests of Osiris or of Isis?
Well, it's the same religion.
The Egyptian priests. Okay.
Yeah. So they preach that Osiris descends, becomes incarnate, is killed by an evil power who's similar to Satan, and then resurrects and ascends back to power. And he does this every year, but this all takes place near the moon. It's basically way up there. But the actual tales that are told of Osiris being a pharaoh and being dismembered and Isis looking for his body parts and all of this taking place on Earth, that story is a myth, and that it represents symbolically the teachings of the religion, which included moral teachings, but also cosmological and social and political teachings.
I think we need to clarify here, because I'm not that familiar with ancient Egyptian religion, and I'm sure my listeners aren't. So basically, they believed in Isis and Osiris as gods, but then they also told stories that there was an actual pharaoh named Osiris. Is that
correct?
Is that what Plutarch is saying?
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
And in fact, there are even, quote unquote, historians of the time of historians of Egypt who tried to fit Osiris into the chronology of pharaohs. Now, we actually have the full chronology of the pharaohs. It's written in stone on the pyramids, and there's no Osiris. We can't fit him in. So we know we can confirm that he's fictional. But of course, we know from Plutarch that the priests also knew that it was fictional. But they did create these stories of this sort of historical king who was deified through this process. I mean, he was born of a god, so he was still a demigod in the same way that Hercules and so on were.
So there's really two historical processes that take place. I want to try to break this down in an overview. And you call this a hemerization, or I might be mispronouncing that.
It's euhemerization.
Euhemerization, yes. Where there's an actual historical king who's turned into a god. Is that right?
No, it's the other way around.
Oh, it's the other way around. Okay.
And to show how this works, it's named after Euhemerus, who was an author of the 3rd century BC. And he wrote a book called The Sacred Scriptures, in which he basically told, as if he was a historian, that he had discovered that, in fact, Zeus and Uranus were past kings, actual historical people who were deified later.
And Zeus is the main god of the Greeks, for those who don't know.
He's the Mount Olympus Zeus. So, and we know for a fact that this is not true. There was no historical Zeus. There was no.
How do we know that for a fact?
Well, we have more than sufficient records to know that there's no way Euhemerus could have known had there been such a god.
Ah, okay. In other words, maybe in 2000 BC, there was a Greek king of some village whose name was Zeus, and the people loved him so much they turned him to a god, but you're saying Euhemerus couldn't have known that.
There's no way Euhemerus could know that. Certainly there's no way Euhemerus could know any of the things that he claims in this book. So it's bogus, right? We know it's bogus.
And when did he live again, Euhemerus?
3rd century BC.
3rd century BC, and he was a Greek, writing about the Greek god.
Yeah, absolutely. So that then became a fashion where there were these gods who were never really clearly placed in history. They were usually just placed in supernatural realms or sort of mythic realms, sometimes actual explicitly cosmic realms. And then over time, people would say, well, let's do the same thing. Let's explain these gods by saying that they were once historical people. And so they started creating biographies about them.
Actually, Plutarch talked about why they did that.
Yeah, well, Plutarch has his own theories as to why they did that. Why they actually did that is a different question.
In other words, Plutarch says they did that because the common people couldn't handle believing in this abstract idea.
That might be true. And there is a hint of that in Plato, in Plato's Republic, where Plato actually recommends this tactic to control the masses.
Really?
By creating religious myths.
Wow.
And controlling them. And then only the guardians, the people who are the elite who know the real truth, they'll be the only ones who know the real truth, but they're going to use the myth.
And the real truth is some cosmic mystical idea.
Yeah. It's a lot like Scientology in that way. If any of you studied that, they do the same thing, which is kind of weird. After 2,000 years, the same trick is being used on the public.
It's interesting. And you're saying the priests, they know better that these stories aren't literal. And as I was reading your book, one of the things that came to mind from my Jewish background was the stories that are told by these rabbis. And many Jews will say, well, of course that didn't really happen. It's a parable being told to express an ethical idea. And I'll just bring one example that my listeners will know, the oven of Aknai, where a voice calls out from heaven and rebukes the rabbis for not listening to this one rabbi. And most Orthodox Jews I know today will say, no, of course there wasn't a voice from heaven. It's trying to express this idea and this principle. And the principle is binding. You've got to accept it, but you don't have to accept that this literally happened. But then I know other Jews who will say, if you don't accept this literally happened, you are a blasphemer. And there was a famous, no, really, and I was raised as an Orthodox Jew, and I once got in trouble for calling into question one of these stories that every soul of every Jew was at Mount Sinai. I said, where does it say that? That's just made up. And I was told that this was heresy. I want to quote a 12th century rabbi. I'm paraphrasing what he said, but he basically said, anybody who believes all of the legends of the Jews, this is a rabbi, he says anyone who believes all of the legends is insane, and anybody who denies them all is a heretic. And his point was that some of them are literally true and some of them aren't, and you have to, I guess, have the discernment to know the difference.
Well, this goes all the way back. We have Philo of Alexandria, the greatest Jewish scholar of his era, this first century, just before the dawn of Christianity. He was making the same point, that some of the stories in the Bible are literal, some of them are figurative, and you only know the truth if you know which is which.
See, I think, I gotta say, I need to go back and read more of Philo, but what I read of Philo that you quoted in your book, he seems to me to be saying, in a sense, the opposite of Plutarch, in that he's saying the masses, they know that there are deeper spiritual things here, and it's only the stupid people, and I think he means the intellectuals, who take these things literally. But the masses, they know there are deeper spiritual allegorical symbols here. I think he's talking about me because I'm one of these literalists, but, whatever. Philo definitely is an allegorist.
That's an interesting take. Philo is speaking from the perspective of an insider as a Jew versus outsiders who are non-Jews, right?
I'm not so sure. I think there may have been an internal Jewish dialogue there.
Yeah, there certainly is. And he's taking the side that you're stupid if you're Jewish and think these things are literal. But we have in the Talmud, we have an example of one of these debates. Yeah. It's one of my favorite ones, where in the book of Ezekiel, of course, Ezekiel has the Valley of Dry Bones parable, where he talks about seeing all these people, these bones rise up and the flesh goes on them and they're all resurrected. The Talmud records a rabbinical debate where some rabbis were saying that this really happened.
Right.
And then other rabbis were saying, no, it's just a metaphor for the resurrection of Israel as a nation.
Right.
And the rabbis who said it was literal says, no, like some of us actually, we claim descent from some of these resurrected people in the Valley of Dry Bones.
Actually, the version I learned when I was a child is that it was 4/5 of or 80% of the Jewish people, or the people of Israel at the time, who misinterpreted the prophecy of when Moses would release them, and they left early and they were wiped out. And Matisyahu, the famous rap singer, has a song about how only 4/5 of Israel left Egypt. And probably most people hear that and have no idea what he's talking about. I heard that. I'm like, oh yeah, he's talking about the Valley of Dry Bones, which are the Israelites who left Egypt and died in the desert, and they'll be resurrected in the final. That's that Talmudic discussion.
Sure.
And that's a really good example. And I'll bring a Hebrew Bible Old Testament example. So some rabbis will say, and some Jewish scholars beyond rabbis will say, that the book of Job never actually literally took place. It's just an allegory. And others who are literalists like me will say, no, yeah, of course there's a deeper message, but also Job happened. And here's, I think, one of the issues I was struggling with when I read Plutarch. And he's talking about the pagan gods, right? He's, nothing that I have any stake in. But I wonder if the other Egyptian priests would have heard that and said, yeah, Plutarch's that liberal theologian. That's why he says that. Or Clea is liberal theologian, and she says these things weren't literally true, but that's because she doesn't have a strong enough faith, or her faith isn't right, or she doesn't have the right discernment. It sounds to me from what Plutarch is saying to Clea is that there's this dialogue within the Egyptian paganism about whether these things are literally true or not. And some people are saying, well, we kind of like in Judaism, you have Maimonides or Rambam, who lived in the 12th century, who is very similar to Plutarch, who said, look, the masses can't handle these things, so we're not going to tell them exactly what's going on. They burned Rambam's books for this, meaning other great intellectuals, not just the ignorant masses. Wow. Are we going to get to Christmas, Dr. Carrier?
I don't know. We're running out of time.
No, but I think this is actually a very important background because then when we jump to Christmas,
True.
It's interesting. So first of all, in the New Testament, it doesn't ever say that Jesus is born on December 25th. I'm just stating the obvious here.
Yeah. Nor is it even plausible that he was.
Assuming he existed, why isn't it plausible?
Assuming you believe that the Gospel of Luke's nativity story is true, it's extremely unlikely that a census would be conducted in December, which would be the worst month for travel and other activity like that. So almost certainly the census would have occurred in a different month, and therefore the birth of Jesus would have occurred in a different month. And in fact, early Christians were on board with this idea, and so they were actually trying to place his birth somewhere in spring.
Really? Why in spring? Do you have any idea why they thought it was in spring? Maybe because he died in spring? Or?
Well, they had theological reasons. I don't know entirely what their reasoning was. They didn't actually have any documentation. There wasn't any.
Okay. So they were speculating when he was born.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of my listeners believe he was born over the Feast of Tabernacles, and they can give you a whole long, complex reason for why that is.
That's an example of what I mean, like theological reasons.
Okay.
But at most, they could have maybe found the month of the census, because that would be in historical records theoretically, and that they could have argued from there. They don't actually say, so we don't actually have that. But the idea of it being December 25th came much later, hundreds of years later. And December 25th was the birth of all sun gods, not Mithra particularly.
Now, do we know that from the ancient sources? This is what I want to verify. Do we actually know that from the pre-Christian sources?
Well, it's hard to say specifically. Like, for example, December 25th is the last day of Saturnalia. We know that from pre-Christian sources. And the Saturnalia is the festival of the god Saturn, but it's also related to the rebirth of the sun. And it goes from the 17th to the 25th, and an 8-day week for the Romans is about the resurrection of the sun kind of thing.
Incidentally, that actually is mentioned in the Talmud in the Tractate of Avodah Zarah. And the Feast of Saturnalia is mentioned as a pagan holiday, but then another rabbi comes along and says, actually, the pagans got it from Adam. Originally, it was a Hebrew holiday, if you will.
That's interesting. I hadn't heard that one. I do know that Christmas trees are condemned as pagan in the Old Testament. The idea of cutting down a tree, bringing it into your house, and decorating it with silver and things like that. You're not supposed to do that. That's the behavior of the pagans, according to the Old Testament. But we have a Christian calendar mid-4th century. It's a Christian calendar, but it's really a calendar of all holidays, not just Christian ones. And it has on there, the December 25th is the birthday of Sol Invictus, which is a sun god.
The invincible sun, right?
Right, exactly. That's the main sun god. There was a rise of Sol Invictus cult in the 3rd century AD, and so it was kind of very popular in that 100-year span. So according to this Christian source, and this is a fairly early Christian source, close enough to the actual events of the 3rd century, for example, to know that this was actually the case. They're not making it up. And then the idea of porting the birth of Jesus to the 25th came later.
It's interesting to say porting, meaning they believed he was born and they had one date and they transferred it to this other date.
Right, let's move it. Yeah, and I think that was political. The reality is they wanted their celebration to overwhelm the pagan celebration. That's their way of erasing the pagan holiday, is just make it a Christian holiday. And then the more people worship the Christian version of it, the less popular the pagan version of it will be. And eventually the pagan will just wither away like a vestigial organ, and what you have left is this Christian celebration.
So how much of that is speculation? In other words, how much do we know for sure that that's... Do we have Christians who come out and say, we're going to make the birthday of Jesus December 25th to get the sun worshipers to join us? Do we have sources like that?
I'm not sure if, insofar as we have them discussing it, it's early Middle Ages. So you can't always be sure that what they're saying, because they'll have their own historical hypotheses as to how this happened. Whether their hypotheses are true or not is yet another question. I think by and large, it's our inference, because we can see the sequence of events. It started a pagan holiday. Now the Christians are making it their holiday. Why would they do that? There are logical reasons to even to say that maybe the medieval historians who are saying this might have had on to something on that.
However, look, if I were a Christian apologist who really loved Christmas, I could come along and say, yeah, you've got a 4th century source that's 300 years after Jesus. And the pagans were competing with Christianity and put the birthday of their son, S-U-N, to get the Christians. I'm not saying it's likely, but it's possible.
Yeah, but it's not likely. And the reason is because the December 25th was associated with, like we have with the Saturnalia, it was associated with the actual solar cycle. So the 21st, of course, is the winter solstice. The days start getting longer again. So it's the resurrection of the sun in the sense that the sun starts waxing rather than waning.
In other words, for those who live in offices like me and don't go outside, so the days get longer and longer and longer until the summer solstice. And then they start to get shorter and shorter and shorter until the winter solstice. And then it's around December 22nd, you're saying, or 21st, when the days start to get longer again.
Yeah, exactly. That's it.
And that's just an observable fact. If you bother to go outside, you'll see.
Yes, it's an astronomical fact. And it was a well-known astronomical fact and a disturbing one from the perspective of primitive peoples. The days are getting shorter. Oh, crap. Eventually, there's not going to be any day left and the sun is going to go out.
Now you force me to quote what it says in the Talmud about Saturnalia. It says, when the first Adam saw the day getting gradually shorter, he said, "Woe is me, perhaps because I have sinned. The world around me is being darkened and returning to its state of chaos and confusion. This, then, is the kind of death to which I have been sentenced from heaven." In other words, he didn't know that they would stop getting shorter, the days. And obviously it's written thousands of years. I believe Adam existed. It's written thousands of years after Adam, or even after the Torah.
From that perspective, right.
So he began keeping an 8 days fast. But as he observed the winter equinox and noted that the day getting increasingly longer, he said, "This is the nature of the world." And he set forth to keep an 8 days festivity. In the following year, he appointed both as festivals. And this is how they're explaining that the Romans have an 8-day period of mourning before the equinox. And they actually mention the Romans, Calenda and Saturnalia, by name here. And then the 8 days up until the equinox was Saturnalia, and afterwards is Calenda. And basically, this is, according to these rabbis, was echoing what the first Adam did. And when I read this, I ask the question, why would the rabbis associate this pagan festival of the Romans with the Adam? And this is my hypothesis, I'm guessing, that they must have seen this in many different cultures and said it can't just be a Roman thing.
Oh, that's entirely plausible. Yeah. I mean, I haven't confirmed that, but yeah, you would expect. And certainly the Roman Saturnalia probably was not invented by the Romans. It may have been adapted from the Etruscans, and we know the Etruscans actually have ties to Turkey, so that actually to what used to be the region of Troy, and that's Anatolia, and that ties you into the Persians and the Assyrians. You can trace a pathway there.
So the rabbis might not have been far off. In other words, primitive man, maybe not the first Adam, the early human beings may have looked up in the sky and said, "We better light some fires because the sun needs some help."
You're right.
Like that's probably what happened.
That's entirely plausible, yes. And I think that's why the 25th came to be so associated with sun cults in general, and long had done so before Christianity came along.
Wow, this is some amazing stuff, and there's so much more to talk about. But I think this is a lot for the people to chew on. Are there any final things you'd like to share? Any final thoughts or ideas?
Well, I would recommend people look up the Saturnalia and the resources online to see what the holiday was like. It's not entirely like our Christmas holiday, but there are a lot of similarities, like the gift giving, the caroling.
Really? That was part of Saturnalia, the gift giving and the caroling?
Oh, yeah. Ribaldly getting drunk and going around town singing. And wreaths on the doors, candles in the window. There's a lot of aspects to it. That mistletoe came much later, I think. That, I think, is an adaptation from Celtic religion. But you can see all of these things being just adopted and brought in and given new meaning into the new Christmas holiday. And of course, then the whole idea of St. Nicholas got transformed into some sort of mythology of this North Pole elf. It's like there's
so what you're basically saying is the Christians took pre-existing elements and adapted it to their religion.
Yeah.
So as a naturalist or a humanist, an atheist, when you celebrate Christmas, what is the significance of it for you?
Oh, to me, it's just tradition and an opportunity to celebrate certain values of Christmas.
What are those values?
This actually ties back to what a lot of times the ancients, the elite priests were saying about their religion, that the myths symbolize certain moral ideas, certain ideas about human values and things. And I think those things can still be true. You can still say that, and they could also be false, but you could say that there's certain values actually are good. Like the idea of the Christmas spirit, the idea, like all of the principles really well captured by A Christmas Carol by Dickens is a really good example of showing a sort of secular take on what the values of Christmas are. And those values are humanist values. We do cherish those values. And so to create a kind of mythic story that we don't really believe in literally, but we do take seriously as a kind of representation of the values. And Christians even do this too. If for the Christians who use the Santa Claus myth, they don't believe there's a literal Santa Claus and that he literally does the things that are said to be done of him. But they accept the whole, or many of them, not all of them, but accept the whole Santa Claus mythology because of the things that it symbolizes about the values of Christmas. That's how we look at the whole thing. It's like,
meaning you secular humanists.
Yeah, us secular humanists see that in the same way. There are secular humanists who abhor all religion and therefore won't celebrate Christmas. But most of us do, the reality is, because we take it as that sort of secular mythology that has humanist values embedded in it that we value.
I see. Wow. Okay. Well, my father was an Orthodox rabbi, and whenever people would say to him, "Merry Christmas," his response was, "Bah, humbug." And, yeah. This has been a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much. You've been listening to Hebrew Voices with Nehemiah Gordon. We were speaking to Dr. Richard Carrier, and you can find his information at richardcarrier.info. I'm going to post the link on nehemiaswall.com. Shalom. As an epilogue, I want to encourage those who are coming from the New Testament perspective to have a look at your own ancient sources. Justin Martyr, as his name implies, was murdered by the Romans for his faith. Around the year 150 CE, he wrote a book that we mentioned in the interview. It's called Dialogues with Trypho. Now, Justin was a pagan Greek from Nablus or Shem. It was called Neapolis at the time in northern Israel. And he converted to Christianity in Greece. Now, although he came from Israel, it's crazy. The first Jew he ever met was this Trypho, who we're told was fleeing from the Bar Kokhba War. It's actually mentioned in the book that he was fleeing from the war, which is Bar Kokhba War between the years 132 and 135. And some people say this Trypho is the famous Rabbi Tarfon mentioned in the Mishnah. It's not clear whether these dialogues were a fiction or whether they actually took place or not. But I find it fascinating because as far as I know, this is the earliest recorded dialogue between a Christian and a Jew. And of course, we're only hearing the Christian side and the words that Justin puts in the mouth of Trypho. But a lot of what Trypho says sounds like what you would expect a Jew to say back then, and much is what a Jew would say today. So I think it's a really interesting book. Now, in chapters 69 and 70, this Justin Martyr, he tackles this whole issue of the pagan parallels between Christianity and the pagan religion. He takes it head on. He actually proclaims that rather than undermining his faith, this issue strengthens his faith. Now, you may not agree with his reasons and conclusions, but at least he's dealing with the reality of the situation. There were many religions in the Roman Empire that sounded uncomfortably to many people, similar to the accounts of Yeshua of Nazareth. Justin says he doesn't feel uncomfortable with the parallels. On the contrary, he embraces these parallels and develops an important aspect of his theology about what they teach him about how Satan operates in the world. And again, you may disagree with Justin. The guy died for his faith, though at least have a look at what he said. And rather than ignoring these parallels to the pagan religions, they're key to Justin's understanding of the divine plan. So this Christmas, as you sit in front of your log or whatever it is that you do, have a look at Justin Martyr's Dialogues with Trypho, chapters 69 and 70, and think about these things. Maybe pray about them. Now, my Jewish listeners were really quick to demonize Christmas. I kind of like what Dr. Carrier had to say about the moral lessons that he believes Christmas embodies. Even if you don't celebrate Christmas, those are good things to think about. Being good to one another and good cheer for men or all that stuff. What we as Jews should do is we should be looking at our ancient sources. And I'm going to post a link to the Babylonian Talmud Avodah Zarah 8a on nehemiaswall.com and see what it says about Kalenda and Saturnalia, which the rabbis believe went back to Adam HaRishon, to the first Adam. Nah, I don't believe it really goes back to the first Adam. But maybe it does go back to the generation of the Tower of Babel. Maybe they looked up in the sky in that first year after the flood and tried to make sense of the seasons. You know, remember in Genesis, it talks about how after the flood, there will always, from that time on, be regular seasons. It says Cholef, Akait, winter and summer. And some people take that to mean that before that, there weren't seasons. I don't know. Maybe there were, maybe there weren't. But anyway, maybe that generation after the flood looked up at the sky as the days were getting shorter and shorter, and they started to get nervous. They had heard God's promise not to destroy mankind with a flood. So maybe now he was going to do it by extinguishing the sun. Might be what they thought. That's what the rabbis seem to have think they thought. Maybe that's why we have this celebration in cultures throughout the world in which people light fires. It's interesting. You've got the Christmas candles on the Christmas tree and the Christmas lights. And in many of the ancient pagan religions, you seem to have these people lighting fires, often large bonfires. And the thinking behind what they're doing, not Christians today, but some of these primitive cultures, is that the sun is dying. And we've got to help out the sun by lighting a fire. We find this in many ancient cultures, which is what the rabbis in the Talmud are trying to make sense of when they say it goes back to the first Adam. So think about that this December 25th and what ancient humans were going through after the flood, or might have been going through, as they saw the days getting shorter, and the jubilation they must have felt when the days started to get longer again around the time of December 25th. Now look, I'm still not going to be celebrating Christmas, not even as a secular holiday. I'll be honest with you, my association that I have with Christmas is not a positive one. What comes to mind for me when I think about Christmas is how the Jews were often persecuted this time of year. How the Gentile multitudes were whipped up into a frenzy, and often it was directed at the Jews. It was the birthday of Christ, and the ones who killed Christ needed to be hurt. And one example is the Jews of Rome, and I don't mean ancient Rome, I mean Rome, the city of Rome, when it was ruled by the popes. They used to force the Jews to run naked through the streets of Rome on Christmas as entertainment for the Christians. I'm going to post a link to the study this rabbi did about that. That's the association I have with Christmas. There's a lot of pain there. I'll be honest with you. Now to everyone, whether you're a Jew, a Christian, or an atheist, open up the books of the Hebrew Bible. Dr. Carrier, an avowed atheist, made reference to a passage in the Hebrew Bible about the pagan precursor of the Christmas tree. And I'm pretty sure he's talking about Jeremiah chapter 10. It's something I've talked about in the Prophet Pearls. And I've always read this as referring to wooden idols. But if an atheist historian like Dr. Carrier tells me that it's talking about Christmas trees, it's at least worth a second look, worth some prayer and reading. So this Christmas, I will be reading Jeremiah 10 and praying for understanding of its true meaning. Shalom.
You have been listening to Hebrew Voices with Nehemiah Gordon. Thank you for supporting Nehemiah's McCour Hebrew Foundation. Learn more at nehemiahswall.com.